This episode, we take a look at one of the greatest villains in English history, a man whose villainy would be immortalized by William Shakespeare, Richard III. Shakespeare called him a lump of foul deformity, poisonous hunchback toad, deformed, unfinished, and a scarce half made up. As for his character, he was described as evil, corrupt, sadistic, and manipulative. But was Richard really the evil troll that Shakespeare made him out to be? And more importantly, did Richard kill his nephews in order to secure his own spot on the throne of England? Why was England even in a position that murder became a reasonable way to ascend to the throne? To lay the groundwork, we have to jump back to 1455, about 28 years before the death of the princess, what is commonly called the War of the Roses. In 1154, Henry II came to the throne after an invasion of England. Having been born in France, he had a very weak claim to the English throne. But with his show of force, he was named heir. This began the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England until June 16th, 1487, and the death of Richard III, the villain of our story. By the mid-1400s, the Plantagenet line had split between two related but separate families, the Lancasters and the Yorks. Each family's crest bore a rose, the Lancasters a red rose, the Yorks a white. In 1455, with an unclear line of succession, both families laid claim to the throne, and in true medieval fashion, they felt the best way to decide the question who would be a series of battles fought on and off over the course of 30-plus years, hence the name the War of the Roses. And this is how Edward IV became king in 1461 to 1470. Then, after a brief removal from the throne, he was again king from 1471 until his death in 1483. In the play Richard III, William Shakespeare tells us Richard is too deformed to be loved. Because he cannot be loved, he will be a villain. He then plans to plot against his brother, George, Duke of Clarence. His plan is to make his older brother, King Edward IV, believe that George is disloyal. Then George will be removed from the picture, and Richard is now closer to the king and give him more power. A truly vile act performed by the evil younger brother. But, or in Shakespearian language, alas, reality might give us a different story. Edward's interruption in rule was due to an uprising by the Lancasters and a familial betrayal. Edward's brother George had sided with the Earl of Warwick to seize Edward's throne. Throughout this, Richard remained loyal to his eldest brother, the king. When Richard retook the throne in 1471, Richard was rewarded, leading troops in battle and even receiving a wound himself. Accordingly to many sources, Richard would also play a part in the killing of Edward Lancaster and Henry VI, two of the leading Lancasters who threatened Edward's rule. Edward would go as far as to trust Richard with command of his largest army in his aborted invasion of France. The land and power granted him by his brother was not the only way Richard found to enrich himself. Through marriage to the widow of Edward of Lancaster. That's right, he married the wife of the man he is rumored to have killed, and through coercion he gained even more land. And when his brother George was executed for his part in the plot to remove Edward from the throne, it was Richard who benefited most, getting much of George's land. With the War of the Roses seemingly behind them, Edward sets about doing kingly stuff. He flexes a little muscle and got on good terms with France. He encouraged the development of the merchant class and made moves to lessen the reliance of the monarchy on Parliament for money. All in all, he was being fairly successful. With an intelligent wife, Elizabeth Woodville, two healthy young sons, Edward and Richard, it would seem were named after himself and his younger brother. It seemed he had laid the groundwork for a long and successful Yorkist dynasty. Through all of this, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, remained loyal servant to his older brother. Then on April 14th, 1483, Edward IV died. It would seem either from pneumonia or typhoid, oddly making him one of the few male members of his family to die of natural causes. His father had died in battle at the hands of the Lancasters, and his sons and brother would meet a very historic and bloody end. With his death, power would pass to his eldest son, Edward V. As Edward was only 12 years old, real power would rest in the hands of regents until the boy became old enough to rule. The real question would be, who were those regents? Whomever became regent would basically have the power of king, at least until Edward reached an age where he could exercise power himself. Edward IV, the father, had thought ahead. He had named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Edward's protector. A date was set for the coronation of young Edward, but as the date approached, the powers that be started to play games. Richard pushed the date of the coronation back, but at least on the surface continued the preparation for Edward's coronation. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Woodville, Edward's mother, and her family wanted to push the coronation forward. This would end Richard's protectorship, allowing Edward's mother and her family to act as regents for the young king. All the while, Richard openly supported his nephew's claim to the throne. With this show of support, Richard made arrangements to meet up with Edward, and together traveled to London for the coronation, now set on June 24th. The late King Edward IV's chamberlain had sided with Richard in the argument, giving an air of legitimacy to the plan. This almost surely would have eased the tension that had developed over the question of who would act as regent for the young king. When the two parties met up, things changed rapidly. Richard had the Woodville leaders accompanying Edward arrested. Anthony Woodville, Edward's uncle, and Richard Grey, Edward's half-brother from his mother's earlier marriage, were charged with treason. Richard then took the young King Edward to London himself. While Woodville and Grey were imprisoned, it still appeared that Richard was moving forward to crown the young Edward. Woodville and Grey would later be executed, but not until Richard had usurped power to the throne. While this was going on, Edward's mother, Elizabeth, fled with her daughters and her youngest son, Richard, Duke of York, to Westminster Abbey, where they sought refuge from Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Again, in these old-time royal family murder thingies, a lot of folks are going to have the same name. So, going to have to try and follow along here. In the meantime, the elder Richard took Edward to the Tower of London. This didn't raise too many red flags, as monarchs routinely stayed in the royal apartments in the Tower while awaiting coronation. Witnesses report seeing the young king wandering around the grounds of the Tower, playing with the guards. Richard, then playing the benevolent uncle, asked Elizabeth to bring his other nephew, Richard, Duke of York, to the Tower. This was with the guise that Edward needed somebody to play with while waiting coronation. Now, this is a weird way to pick your ruler, just whoever happened to pass through the right birth canal in the right order. And when you are sitting around worrying about someone for your next ruler to have to play with while waiting their crowning, you really have to start rethinking your choices of your form of government. Anyway, I couldn't find out just how Richard convinced Elizabeth to send her other son to the Tower, but she sent him. Maybe it was Richard's famed ability to manipulate people. Maybe Elizabeth thought, what's the worst that could happen? After all, everybody knew the young king was in the Tower, and the elder Richard seemed fully supportive of his nephew's claim to the throne. Once again, witnesses reported seeing the two boys playing around the Tower grounds. This might have given their mother a short lived hope that things were going to work out. But soon, signs began to turn south very quickly. Theologian Ralph Shaw began to preach that Edward V was illegitimate. Why? Remarkably, this has nothing to do with the fact that Elizabeth Woodville had been widowed by her first husband, but had to do with the dating life of King Edward IV. He based this on the idea that Edward IV had promised to marry Lady Eleanor Butler. While this promise of marriage might have simply been a way for Edward to get Lady Eleanor in bed, he was a bit of a womanizer. If taken seriously, it could spell trouble. According to several sources, this line of, "Hey, get with me and I will make you Queen of England," was a known ploy of Edward's IV's way to try and get women in bed, and supposedly it worked rather well. However, this previous engagement made the later marriage to Elizabeth Woodville null and void. As crazy as it seems, you would hope no one would accept this line of thinking, but it worked. If Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth was illegitimate, then Richard, Duke of Gloucester, would be the rightful heir to the throne, and Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, would be cut out of the royal line. On June 26, 2 days after Edward was to be crowned, Parliament voted to uphold Richard, Duke of Gloucester's claim to the throne, making him Richard III, King of England. Why would Parliament do this? Pass the power to a man who was clearly out to usurp the crown? It could be they believe this BS story that because Edward had been betrothed to Eleanor, he could never marry anyone else ever again, no matter what, and somehow his children are now illegitimate. But what is more likely is that a 12-year-old King of England may not have been the stability that Parliament was looking for. The Lancasters still had their supporters. A weak king could easily lead to a resurgence of the civil wars that had gripped England for almost 30 years. And of course, France was always an English issue. It is possible that Parliament hoped Richard III could be the man to prevent more bloodshed. If this is what Parliament had hoped, they could not be further from the truth. Shortly after the coronation of Richard III, the young princess vanished from the Tower. In autumn of 1483, revolts began to spring up across the country. Evidence suggests that at least one goal of these rebellions was to rescue the young princess. Some of the rebels were former Yorkist loyalists. Rumors circulated the princess had come to harm or were going to come to harm. Richard easily could have produced the princess to quell some of the rebellious nature. However, the princess would not be seen again. Also around this time, Richard will lose support of one of his most important loyalists, the Duke of Buckingham. Some had implicated Buckingham in the death of the princess. He was the constable of the Tower at the time, and it'd be hard to imagine that something like this could have happened under his watch without him at least having some idea of what was going on. But now, Buckingham swung his support to Henry Tudor, aka Henry VII. Henry had a weak claim to the throne through his distant connection to the Lancaster line. We'll talk about that more later. Now the War of the Roses restarted. This time the Yorks is trying to hold the throne for Richard III, and the Lancaster forces and forces loyal to Henry Tudor trying to secure the throne for Henry. It was the Battle of Bosworth that was a climax of the conflict. According to contemporary sources, Richard spotted Henry on the battlefield and, in an attempt to bring the contest to an end, led a cavalry charge. Now, this does not seem to fit the character of the evil, troll-like man that history has painted Richard to be. It seems that Richard led from the front. He was a man of action that people willingly followed into battle. He could still be evil and corrupt, of course, but he was far from a coward. It would be this final charge that would spell an end for Richard. His horse killed, he found himself on foot, thus the line in the Shakespeare play, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. Now, on foot in a cavalry fight is a bad place to find yourself. Richard would be killed. His crown, still with blood on it according to legend, was then placed on Henry's head, and Henry became Henry VII, King of England. So, back to our main story, what happened to the princes? The most common belief is that Richard had the princess killed, most likely in October of 1483. This would not only make him a truly evil person killing children, but also the worst uncle in the world. I may not be the best uncle on the planet, but I have never once entertained the idea of offing my nephews to usurp their stuff. One, they don't have anything I want, and two, that's just plain evil. Now, my nieces, that's a different story. Carson, you know what you did. The 16th century humanist Sir Thomas More pointed the finger at one James Tyrrell. Tyrrell had proven a loyal and dedicated soldier to Richard. According to More, Tyrrell smothered the boys in their sleep and then buried the bodies inside the tower. More's case seemed to build largely around the fact that Richard had knighted Tyrrell for these actions. But it appears Tyrrell was knighted before the princes went missing. Now, this doesn't completely exonerate Tyrrell, but it does call into question More's series of events and the quid pro quo motive. Others point the finger at Henry Tudor. Henry came to the throne after defeating Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field. In August 1485, Richard died a very brutal death, basically being hacked to pieces, a scene made famous by Shakespeare. This marked the end of the War of the Roses, the Plantagenet line, the York dynasty, and the beginning of the Tudor reign. So if Henry was involved, the motive would be simple, to remove any York's claims to the throne. However, very little evidence exists to support this fact. In fact, later events make it seem unlikely that Henry knew the fate of the princess. Henry would be crowned King Henry VIII of England and then married Elizabeth of York, the eldest sister of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, meaning he married the niece of Richard III, the man Henry's forces had killed in battle, allowing Henry to take the throne. This marriage also gave him a more legitimate claim to the throne. Okay, time to run down some of the wild goings on. Richard III most likely kills Edward of Lancaster, then marries his wife. This allows him to take what had been Edward Lancaster's land and money, then coerces an elderly widow to give him control of her land. Then, very possibly, kills his nephews to take the throne. Then Henry VII, supported by the Lancasters, claims the throne, sparking another war, leading Richard to getting big time chopped up. Then Henry marries Richard's eldest niece, sister of the boys Richard is supposedly to have had murdered, and a York. So this marriage gave Henry a better claim to the throne, but also effectively united the Lancaster and Yorks in what was now the Tudor dynasty. Hopefully, we're all caught up. Now, this brings us to another theory, one that both princes escaped the tower. Over the next few years, men came forward claiming to be both Edward V and the younger Richard. It is not impossible to believe that Richard III, contrary to his image passed to us through history and literature, might have even helped the prince's escape. With Tudor forces closing in, Richard could have smuggled his nephews out of the tower for safekeeping. This would, of course, totally contradict everything we know about Richard III. It is important to note that our sources on Richard, including Shakespeare, were living in Tudor England. With the throne solidly in the hands of the Tudors, it would be wise to paint the Yorks as fiends and the Tudors as heroes. Two of the most interesting men to come forward were Lambert Simnel. Simnel claimed to be Earl Warwick, while neither Richard nor Edward The Earl Warwick was the nephew of Edward the Fourth and Richard the Third, giving him a claim to the throne even stronger than that of Henry Tudor. The only problem with this con was the fact that the real Earl of Warwick was sitting in the Tower, a prisoner of Henry. Simnel was captured, and Henry quickly figured out that Simnel was little more than a patsy. He was being used by Yorkists in an attempt to gain support to remove Henry from the throne. Henry became convinced that Simnel was a harmless rube who had gotten in way over his head. You can imagine this guy sitting out at the pub telling people, "I'm an earl, I am," just hoping to score a couple free drinks, while two rich Yorkies sitting in the corner look at each other with this, "I have a great idea." In any case, Simnel must have been one hell of a talker, because in an odd turn of events, Henry gave Simnel a position working in the royal kitchens. So, from probably getting your head chopped off to making sandwiches for the king. Later, another man came forward, this time claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger prince, with whom Edward III, dead, would have been the rightful heir to the crown. This man, named Perkin Warbeck, had his supporters, including the King of France, the Holy Roman Emperor, and James IV of Scotland. But the King of France would sign a treaty with Henry VII, refusing to support anyone else who made a claim to the throne. The latter two would support his failed attempts at an invasion. He also invaded with support of Scots and Irish forces. It was not important that Warbeck raise a large army to defeat Henry. In fact, he was unable to do that, gathering only a few thousand at the most. What was important is that he find people in England to join his cause, primarily nobles. And while many Scots rallied to his cause, it seems that few Englishmen were willing to back him. While many said that Warbeck looked an awful lot like Edward IV, no one could prove his identity one way or the other. Since the disappearance of the princes, stories spread that while Edward V had died, some say of natural causes, others that Richard's men carried out the job on the young king. The story also said that Richard had been smuggled out of England to the continent in order to protect him from both Edward originally and Henry. One version of the story has the man assigned to killing young Richard as having a change of heart at the last moment and helping the prince flee. Warbeck himself even told this story to explain how a young man from Flanders could be the rightful king of England. However, when an invasion from Scotland faltered, Warbeck was captured. At first, he was treated much more like a guest than a prisoner. But Henry refused to allow a meeting between his wife, Elizabeth, the sister of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, and Warbeck. Having been raised alongside her brother, she could have told whether or not Warbeck was or was not really the young Richard. Was this refusal on the part of Henry out of the fear that Warbeck was in fact the lost prince? If Henry knew the prince had died earlier in the Tower, at his or Richard's orders, it would seem that he would have nothing to lose by allowing a meeting between Elizabeth and Warbeck. Or was this a way to protect his wife from what could have been a traumatic experience, meeting this fake and having to relive the tragic death of her brothers? Or it could have just been that Henry didn't want to buy into anything Warbeck had to say. In any case, Warbeck clearly became tired of being held prisoner, whether benevolent or not. His failed escape attempt was the last straw, and it was decided that it was time to get rid of him once and for all. Warbeck was forced to confess that he was not Richard. How much we can trust this confession, which was surely coerced, is perhaps irrelevant. He was sentenced to death, and both Warbeck and the Earl of Warwick were put to death in 1499. Two sets of young bodies were found in the tower. The first, two small bodies found interned in a wall. Internment was a far more common form of torture and murder than you might think. common enough that these bodies were not automatically thought to be the two princes. It is also important to note here that a lot of people, including children, had died in the Tower of London. The next set of remains were found buried under a set of stairs in the tower. The stairway had not been there at the time of Richard III. While very little effort was made to find the identity of these bodies, with some even questioning if they were male or female, but because the bones found in the 17th century were in a manner and location that seemed to match the story told by Sir Thomas More, it led most to believe these to be the bodies of the two young princes. The bones were placed in an urn and reinterred in Westminster Abbey. For many, this answered the question of what happened to the princess in the tower. Fast forward a few hundred years to 2012, and the body of Richard III is found by workers tearing up a car park in Leicester, England, near the site of Richard III's final battle. Now, this seems to be a odd but maybe fitting place for Richard III to end up spending his eternity, underneath a parking lot in some far-flung field in England. The body had DNA testing that shows that it was, in fact, of the Yorkshire line. The age, the curved spine, along with objects found in the grave, left little doubt that this was, in fact, Richard III. With this discovery, many people called for DNA testing of the remains of the princess in Westminster Abbey to finally answer the question of the fate of the young princess. However, the British royal family has refused to give permission to test the DNA of the bones in the urn, claiming that it would set a bad precedent of people going around digging up royal graves. Now, apparently that's only a bad thing if you're European. If you're not European, go ahead and dig up royal graves. We don't care. Richard III was the last English king killed in battle. He was vilified by history as a monster, both physically and psychologically, who murdered his nephews to take the throne, only to have it taken from him a mere 2 years later. And while the remains found in 2012 show Richard had a curved spine, it was far from the caricature written about in Shakespeare. His loyalty to his elder brother, if not a long con, does not fit the popular image of Richard. Is it possible Richard III was just the villain that the Tudors needed to justify their own rule? Or was he a ruthless child killer? After all, in medieval Europe, taking the crown by regicide was an accepted behavior. So would it really be an unthinkable step to murder a child king? I would like to give thanks to some of the sources used in this episode: The Story of Britain, From the Romans to the Present, A Narrative History by Rebecca Fraser, 1950, waroftheroses.com. Yep, War of the Roses has its own website. Britannica, History UK, Royal UK, and the BritishHeritage.com. Please join us next time on History is Criminal as we look at the OG of escape artist, Jack Shepherd. Until then, this has been History is Criminal.